All right, let's take the next step, shall we? I want to go back in this session to launch off of a comment that Jesus made in Luke 24. And we observed it, but I want to draw out its full significance, and then that'll launch us deep into the rabbit hole as we go. So let's look back at Luke 24:44. That's how I remember it, 24:44. It just has a way of sticking in the brain. When Jesus is having this Bible study, post-resurrection Bible study with his disciples, and he gives that summary of the Old Testament scriptures, the Messiah suffering, rising from the dead, third day, so that repentance and forgiveness goes to the nations. It's Old Testament 101, according to Jesus. Notice the way that Jesus refers to the scriptures. When he was walking and playing dumb while he was walking on the road, he called it the Torah and prophets. Or he called it Moses and the prophets. Here he calls it the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms. So there's a pattern there. Jesus has a way of it's a window into how Jesus thought about the organization of these writings. And he talks about it in his teachings in two ways. Sometimes as a two-part collection, he'll talk about Torah and prophets. Sometimes as a three-part collection, Torah, prophets, and in this case, the Psalms. So, that could be of just passing interest. It's just his way of talking about the top 10 list or something. Torah, prophets, Psalms. It doesn't account for like the book of Job, or it doesn't account in the eyes, depending on what comes to your mind when you think of the prophets. You may think, well, he left out the historical books. Well, the historical books are about ancient history, so of course those wouldn't be about pointing forward to anything because they're about the past, and so, you might kind of process it that way and then just move on. But the fact is there's actually something really, really significant here, because Jesus wasn't the only Jewish teacher in his time to refer to the scriptures in this way. In fact, Jesus is giving a standard type of reference to the scriptures that we find all over Jewish writings from the same period. So I have this handout on how to read a text like the Hebrew Bible. And what you'll find on the first page of that handout is two different ways of organizing the Old Testament scriptures. In the left-hand column is the organization that came after Jesus, though the name is just naming something that obviously is from the time of Jesus. It's a conception of the scriptures called Tanakh. And it's an acronym for this three-part organization that Jesus is getting at here: Torah, prophets, and Psalms. So I'm just highlighting the left-hand column here. So Torah, it's a Hebrew word meaning instruction. And that accounts and often that can actually sometimes refer to all of the Old Testament scriptures. And a number of times in Jesus' teachings, he'll quote from the book of Psalms, but call it a quotation from the Torah. Because it means instruction. So it can refer to the divine instruction of all the scriptures, or, depending on context, can refer in the three-part formula to the three sections. So Torah, accounting for what Christians call the Pentateuch. That's a Christian name for it. Then in the Tanakh organization, the prophets, notice what the prophets account for. Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which are typically called history in Christian orderings and conceptions of these writings, but that's not the oldest conception of them. In the Jewish tradition that Jesus grew up in, these are prophetic texts, which may mean a little tweaking of our concept of what biblical prophecy is, or at least a broadening or widening. So this is a narrative about Israel's past from the divine perspective of the prophets, with an eye towards where the story is going. We'll talk more about how narratives can be a form of forward-pointing prophecy. So then, after the narrative, 4 narrative works, you get the 15 classic works of the prophets. Then in the Tanakh organization, the last section, the Ketuvim, it got the name the writings, and that makes sense, because writings is a pretty generic term, and it covers a really broad collection of material here. So books like Psalms, Job, Proverbs, often are called the wisdom books are in here, but also narrative works like Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, Chronicles. The ordering of books within the writings varies depending on manuscript and history. However, one of the most consistent orderings of the writings has the book of Psalms leading this third collection. And think through to Jesus' reference again. The Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms. It's more than likely that is naming not just the book itself, but the whole final third collection. How do we know this? I just have here a list of just a handful of selections of both Jesus' comments about the Old Testament and also citations from other Jewish texts from the time period of Jesus. And you'll notice a pattern here. The wisdom of Ben Sira. You guys know about the wisdom of Ben Sira? It's in Catholic editions of the Bible, because it's in a collection of works that came to be called the Deuterocanon or the Apocrypha. But it's such an amazing book. It's a Jewish sage who lived in Jerusalem around the 160s, 170s BC. And he's got the whole of the scriptures in front of him. He knows these scriptures like even to say the back of his hand. He has them completely wired into how he sees the world. And he's both offering his own wisdom to the generation, but it's one of the first great works of biblical theology that's itself a different work. He's got his whole set of scriptures in front of him, and he's summarizing its wisdom for his generation, which is right before the Maccabean revolt in Jerusalem, if you know about that period. It's really interesting. Anyway, his grandson later wrote a prologue to the book, and look what he says. He says, my grandfather, was a master of the scriptures, and he says, many great teachings have been given to us through the law, the Torah, the prophets, and the others that follow them. So look again at the Ketuvim, the writings. How would you summarize that group of writings? Right? What are you going to call it? The prophets? No. Is it the wisdom books? Well, there are wisdom books in there, but a whole lot more. So Ben Sira's grandson went for the others that follow them. So my grandfather, Yeshua, that was Yeshua Ben Sira, his name, devoted himself especially to the reading of the Torah and prophets and the other books of our ancestors. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a reference to the scrolls of Moses, the words of the prophets, and of David. And what book is traditionally connected to David? Especially the book of Psalms. Even though he only is connected to 73 out of the 150 poems, it's still mainly associated with him. Philo of Alexandria, he's down in Egypt. These people didn't know each other, and he talks about the laws, the oracles, and the Psalms. So you can see this is a widespread conception. So that's one thing. First of all. Second of all, this may seem silly to point out, but it's good to. This technology of organizing text did not exist in this era where these people are talking. This is called a codex, and in Jesus' day, this is brand new, and only the Romans, elite Romans and a few Greeks have been doing this thing. So whenever you see the word book in the Bible, what you need to translate in your mind is scroll. So just stop and think about this. So these texts exist as a unity in people's minds. There isn't one scroll that has all of this literature in one place. The temple, for sure, has all of these scrolls in one place. And there would be synagogues, there would be scholars, but it would be very rare for all of the scrolls to be like in someone's home. It would be a community set of property that perhaps a synagogue owns, and that's where you go. And which means that how you learn the scriptures is in a communal setting, It's by hearing them. It's by the fact that your mom and dad have memorized most of it, and then they sing it to you at bed every night, and you recite it at Sabbath meals, and so on. So just stop and register that point. So then for Jesus to be so immersed in the Scriptures and to have it mentally organized in his mind in this three-part way, because that's how we think about it as a people. So Jesus is not alone in this three-part shape. And it seems to me that then this three-part shape must have some close connection with how Jesus summarizes how it communicates and what it's about. In other words, there's something about this three-part shape. I'm shifting over here. This is going to be my visual abstraction of this three-part shape. But this exists in people's minds who grew up on this literature, that it exists in their minds and hearts in this three-part shape, and somehow that shape is connected in Jesus' mind to its content, namely a story about the Messiah, suffering, rising, repentance, forgiveness to the nations. In other words, the way that our Bibles are organized actually preload interpretive assumptions about what the texts mean. Now, if you look at how our English Bibles are organized, this is an organization that also has pretty ancient roots. The organization in an average, most modern Bibles today will go like this. Pentateuch. Same as the Torah, yeah? Then come a large block of narrative books. They're often conceived of as history. And Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings are in there. But then you got Ruth put in between there. And for a very good reason. Anybody? What's the opening sentence of Ruth? It came about when the judges governed. It makes perfect sense, actually. But what that tells you so think about how that works in the Tanakh then. In the Tanakh, Ruth is down here in the writings, which means even though it's in a separate collection, mentally, that opening line's a glowing blue hyperlink, isn't it? And you are mentally meant to fit it in to a relationship with other writings in this collection, even though they don't exist on the same scroll. But once you understand how the collection works, you begin to see every part's hyperlinking to other parts. It's like Tanakh karate right there. Whereas this organization in our more modern Bibles just take the hyperlink so seriously they put the book here. But the fact is that the book of Ruth is actually hyperlinked to more than just the book of Judges. It's also hyperlinked to the book of Proverbs, but that's a whole separate class. After this, in our modern Bibles, come a collection of what's called poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, and then you get the prophets as like a ski jump at the end. So this also is a way of organizing the Bible that makes a certain sense, but I do think it predisposes us to think of the Pentateuch and the history as about the past, poetry as, well, that's the nice kind of like beautiful stuff, and it's wonderful to help us create worship songs. And then there's the prophets, because that's the stuff about the future. Now that's a caricature, but I don't think it's a completely wrong one. I think that is certainly the way I conceived of the Bible for many years. The past, the beautiful stuff, and then the forward-pointing prophecy. And my main point here is just to say Jesus has a different paradigm, a different conception of how this literature is organized. And the fact that in this organization, you can kind of summarize it down to one basic set of ideas, which I've repeated many times now, but it's Luke 24:44. So I think the order is significant, and I think it will help us enter a different way of conceiving of what these texts are, what they're saying, that will help us process when Jesus says something like this. Jonah is brought up one time in the teachings of Jesus. It's quite famous, actually. Yeah. I'll go to the version in Matthew. You can also find it in Luke. In Matthew chapter 12, Jesus, we're pulling this right out of context here. We're chapter 12, verse 38. Jesus has been duking it out with the Pharisees since the beginning of this chapter. This is like conflict number 4. So the leaders of Israel at this point, for the first time in Matthew's narrative, are beginning to reject Jesus, even though he's trying to get their attention. And the culminating conflict is where they say, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." In the context, he's just healed 2 people in previous. So we want to see a sign. So it's meant to hit you as like, really? Gosh, must be, right? And so Jesus, first of all, quotes from Moses. He quotes from Deuteronomy 32, from the poem that Moses sang in Deuteronomy 32. He calls this generation of Israel an evil and adulterous generation. And you want a sign. And you're not going to get any sign except the anti-sign, the upside-down sign, the sign of Jonah the prophet. Just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the sea monster, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will stand up with this generation at the judgment and will condemn it because they repented at the, my commentary, lackluster preaching of Jonah. And behold, something greater than Jonah is here. You finish the sentence. Do you get it? So let's just go with verse 41. There's no punctuation in ancient Greek manuscripts, but if there were, this would be a ... Here. Do you see that? Mm-hmm. The men of Nineveh will stand up. Why? Because at the preaching of Jonah, they repented. Someone greater than Jonah is here, and what are they not doing? They're doing the opposite of repenting. There's an inversion here. And so you're the opposite of the Ninevites. And what is Jesus in relationship to Jonah? Are you with me? So this is more, he's not just like quoting the cardboard children's book here. He's doing something very sophisticated, actually. Yeah. So his generation is like the generation that Moses had to put up with for 40 years. He's quoting right from Deuteronomy 32 right here. That's a hyperlink. And so listen, Jonah, do you think Jesus is unaware of the negative portrait of Jonah? Are you? Of course not. So he knows that at a very like a stubborn, rebellious prophet was able to bring about the repentance of Sin City in the ancient world. He knows what the story is about. So you can see what he's doing here. He's turning the whole story inside out as a way of looking at this present moment. So here I am, a greater than Jonah, and you all can't even like match the Ninevites. In fact, there's almost something here where it's as if he's Jonah, and they're worse than Jonah, and they're worse than the Ninevites. Jesus, dude, it's like a kung fu master right here. So that's just the Ninevite stuff. But then check out this. Verse 40, this sign. And all of this is a sign to them. What does that even mean? It's a sign. Here's the sign that you get. You hate me and reject me. That's the sign that you get. Let's just go with the second half of the comparison. What's he referring to? The Son of Man being in the heart of the earth? What's he pointing to here? Pointing to his own death and resurrection. Who's going to kill him? Who's going to get him killed, at least? The people that he's talking to, right? So here's the sign that you'll get. You're going to kill me because you're like worse than Jonah. And you're worse than the Ninevites. And then he brings in this Jonah getting swallowed by the sea monster. Now notice it doesn't say whale. Now this is interesting. That's because it's not the word whale. The Greek word that he's citing here, it's the word ketos. We'll come back to it later in the course. It's the Greek word for sea monster. They have a perfectly good word for fish in Greek, and this ain't it. It's the word monster. So in Jesus' conception, Jonah is swallowed by a monster of the deep. And his journey through the belly of the monster is like unto Jesus' journey through death and out the other side. Dude, you can take a long walk and many cups of tea and just think about what Jesus is doing right here. So this is what I'm talking about. When Jesus thinks about the Torah, prophets, and the writings, and he thinks about 1.5 pages that we call the book of Jonah, for him, we're instantly into the core themes of the nations, Israel's role before the nations. Jonah is like this, some kind of a way for us to think about rebellious Israel, but also a way for us to think about some inverted version of what Israel is supposed to be, a prophet to the nations. And then here we are with this 3 days through death into life on the other side thing again. So here's what I'm after. I want to read my Bible like Jesus does. Amen. I want to see what he's seeing, not just in the places where he mentions it. I want to understand the whole thing this way. And I think this 3-part way of organizing things gets us into that ballpark.